Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qizhi. Coming up in this edition, Israel and Iran have exchanged new rounds of attacks following US airstrikes against 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. Sudanese Prime Minister Kamil Idris has announced plans to set up a new non-partisan and technocratic government. And Singaporean Prime Minister Lawrence Wong is in Beijing for a 5-day official visit, with meetings with Chinese leaders on the agenda. We begin in the Middle East. Israel and Iran have continued to trade attacks after the United States struck 3 Iranian nuclear sites on Sunday. The Israeli military says it attacked 6 Iranian airports on Monday, damaging runways and aircraft. Iranian media Press TV has released footage showing Iran shooting down Israeli drones. Another Iranian media outlet also reported that Iran launched a cyber attack against Israel, obtaining large amounts of data of Israeli journalists and celebrities. Israel said its air force launched strikes against Iranian military facilities in Kermanshah. Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei vowed to punish Israel in his first public comment following the US attacks. US President Donald Trump said monumental damage was done to all nuclear sites. But the International Atomic Energy Agency says the damage to the facilities is unclear and that there's no increase in off-site radiation. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian says the US attacks revealed that Washington is the main factor behind Israeli attacks. Oil prices have surged to a 5-month high. Jonathan Regev has more from Tel Aviv.
Israel did not officially mention what it believes is the damage caused to those 3 nuclear plants, but Israel is backing the American assessments, saying that heavy damage was inflicted to all those 3 places, and more than anyone, the Fordo nuclear plant, which is dug deep under the ground, some 60 or 80 meters under the Iranian mountains, and those that plant was apparently penetrated by the heavy bombs which were launched by the B-2 American bombers. Israel is backing the American assessment, saying that heavy damage was inflicted to this plant and to other plants. Now comes the question of if and when there will be some kind of an exit strategy. It depends a lot on what Iran can do regarding Israel and regarding the United States. If Iran decides to retaliate on the American attack by striking American targets in the region, then this would call for further American intervention and this war will go on. And the United States said that an attack on its bases, then they will react. If the war continues in its current status, then perhaps there's an issue of the Iranians going back to negotiations, perhaps showing more flexibility. And in this case, if the flexibility shown by the Iranians is one that may satisfy the United States, then the Americans may be asking Israel to perhaps refrain from more attacks, and this war would eventually come to an end. We do not know yet. Sirens sounding in many parts of Israel, including central Israel where we are, but it was far from being the major launches that we saw before. It was one missile that was intercepted, but still there is I think an understanding that more missiles will be fired towards Israel in the coming days, and it will be up to Israel to decide if and how to react. As far as Israel is concerned at this time, the war is on and the strikes in Iran continue.
That was Jonathan Regev reporting from Tel Aviv. Hundreds of people have gathered to protest in Tehran after the US strikes on Sunday. President Masoud Pezeshkian joined parts of the demonstration against the US and Israel. There are growing concerns over how the Iranian military might respond. Separ Sarimi has more from Tehran.
100%. Certainly Iran would respond to these strikes perpetrated by the US. As you have seen in the last 1 week and a half, Iran has been retaliating against Israel every night and every day. Iran is going to respond. But when and how, it's not determined yet. We have to let the IRGC commanders and military commanders decide on that. You know, what I see on media outlets and on Telegram channels that say Iranians feel like that, Iranians feel like this, I'm surprised. Because Iran is not a nation of 2 million and 3 million. There are 90 million people living in Iran. So there are a variety of feelings. There are a variety of senses that we can feel across the country. Some people are afraid, some people don't actually care about the missiles. Some people just doing their business. Some people are panicked. But personally, what I've seen around myself, what bothers Iranians more than missiles and drones is that the net has been shut down in the 72 hours, just so they don't go to work, they don't go to school, they don't go to university. They are kind of feeling bored. Last time I told myself, okay, the war is over because they have launched strikes in Fordo, Natanz, and now they have reached their objectives. But surprisingly, I heard the explosions in the sky. So now this complicated question ushers in that what's the end game? What will happen in the future? So I think that situation on the ground is very unpredictable these days.
Now they say Iran should negotiate. Something is fishy here. They are scared now. Until now, do you think we have been fighting with Israel? It's been the U.S. as the main player. All Israeli arms and planes are American.
People are here today to urge the government to respond to the U.S. attacks. If we do not respond, they will definitely be more rude and continue bullying. Our armed forces should give them a crushing response as soon as possible.
I cannot talk on behalf of every citizen here, but many people are panicked, afraid, and actually many people are angry because now two countries are striking us. We have Israel launching missiles, drone jet fighters every night, and we have U.S. striking our nuclear facilities.
Dr. Seppa Sarami reporting. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council has held an emergency meeting to discuss the US and Israeli airstrikes on Iran. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres urged efforts to end fighting and resume talks on Iran's nuclear program. China's permanent representative to the UN also condemned the US strikes on Iran. Mitch McCann has more from New York.
At Sunday's Security Council meeting, the UN Secretary-General reiterated his call for an immediate halt to the fighting and a return to negotiations. Antonio Guterres said a credible solution must include full access for the International Atomic Energy Agency to all nuclear sites in Iran.
We face a stark choice. One path leads to wider war, deeper human suffering, and serious damage to the international order. The other leads to de-escalation, diplomacy, and dialogue. We know which path is right.
The Secretary-General's comments follow a White House decision to strike 3 Iranian nuclear sites, including the use of so-called bunker-buster bombs. It marks a dramatic escalation of tensions in the region. The Council also heard from Rafael Mariano Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who briefed members on the impact of the strikes, including damage at the Fordo facility, the primary target in the attacks.
Craters are visible at the Fordo site, Iran's main location for enriching uranium at 60%, indicating the use by the United States of America of ground-penetrating munitions. This is consistent with statements from the United States. At this time, no one, including the IAEA, is in a position to assess the underground damage at Fordo.
Grossi also told the Council Iran says there has been no increase in off-site radiation levels at all 3 sites. Like other members of the international community, China condemned the violence and said it is deeply concerned about the situation getting out of control.
China strongly condemned the U.S. strike on Iran and the bombing of nuclear facilities under the safeguard of the IAEA. The actions of the United States seriously violated the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the international law, as well as Iran's sovereignty, security, and territory integrity.
At the Council, an Iranian spokesperson criticized the U.S., calling it ironic that the only country to have used nuclear weapons is now demanding Iran never acquire one.
The timing, nature, and the scale of Iran's proportionate response will be decided by its armed forces. The United States, a permanent member of this council, the depositary of the NPT, and the only state that has ever used nuclear weapons, murdering millions in 2 cities, has now once again resorted to illegal force, waged a war against my country under a fabricated and absurd pretext, preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. What a bitter and tragic irony.
They also said the attacks marked another stain in the political history of the United States.
That was Mitch McCann reporting from New York. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi is in Moscow for talks on regional and international developments. He says Iran and Russia maintain close coordination on all issues and that the regional situation demands clearer, firmer and more united positions from both sides.
Whether it's Israel or the United States, their attacks on nuclear facilities and research centers are clear violations of the UN Charter. There is no imminent threat justifying such actions. This is outright aggression. Iran and Russia have long shared common concerns, mutual interests, and often common adversaries. We think together, support one another, and maintain close coordination to confront shared challenges. This cooperation will continue tomorrow and beyond. At this critical juncture, the international order is under serious threat. Our talks with Russia carry great significance, and we are committed to doing our utmost to safeguard regional and global stability.
Araghchi also urged the UN Security Council and other international bodies to take action against what it called US aggression. Speaking on the sidelines of the meeting of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Istanbul, he said the US and Israel have crossed a red line.
The warmongering and lawless administration in Washington is solely and fully responsible for the dangerous consequences and far-reaching implications of its act of aggression. Of course, the door for diplomacy should be always keep open, but this is not the case right now. My country has been under attack, under aggression, and we have to respond based on our legitimate right of self-defense. And we will do that as long as needed and necessary. It's irrelevant to ask Iran to return to diplomacy because we were in the middle of diplomacy. We were in the middle of talks with the United States when Israelis blew it up. And again, we were in the middle of talks and negotiation with Europeans, happened only 2 days ago in Geneva, when this time Americans decided to blow it up.
The 51st session of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the OIC was in Istanbul on Saturday and Sunday. The OIC issued a declaration on growing tensions between Iran and Israel, but left out reference to US involvement. Mihail Bardavit has more.
It is a death trap.
On Sunday, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation's Council of Foreign Ministers Summit concluded in Istanbul. In its final declaration, the OIC condemned what it called the aggression of Israel and announced plans to establish a ministerial contact group tasked with engaging regional and international governments to support de-escalation efforts related to Iran. However, the declaration made no mention of the U.S. attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. Some analysts say this omission was expected, suggesting the statement was intended to be symbolic rather than actionable to avoid wider consequences.
In the short run, perhaps in the next couple of days, it looks like Iran will not want to go back to the table because they believe that they are not the ones who have left the table at the first place.
A highlight of the OIC summit was the attendance by Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. At a press conference on Sunday, he urged the UN Security Council to convene an emergency session and condemn the U.S. strikes on Iran, which he called a clear violation of international law.
The U.S. administration holds sole and full responsibility for the consequences of its actions, including the Islamic Republic of Iran's right to self-defense under the principles of the United Charter. Iran reserves all options to defend its security, interests, and people.
Araghchi also accused U.S. President Donald Trump of betraying his voters by supporting Israel, stating that Washington had crossed a red line. Meanwhile, Turkey's foreign ministry issued a statement warning that ongoing tensions could escalate into a broader global conflict. It stressed that negotiations are the only viable path to resolving disputes over Iran's nuclear program. Yet here in Istanbul, Arakci reiterated that diplomacy cannot resume while Iran remains under attack.
That was Mihail Bardavit in Istanbul. Turning to Africa, Sudanese Prime Minister Kami Idris has announced plans to set up a new non-partisan and technocratic government. He says the new government will be based on competence, experience and integrity, free from quotas and favoritism. The move comes as the conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces entered its third year. Idris has dissolved the country's caretaker government. Sophia Shimichero reports.
Sudan's Prime Minister is set to form a one-of-a-kind government composed of 22 independent experts.
The civilian government of hope is the first government in Sudan's history to combine two good components: technocrats, which means governing the people through the agency of their servants, scholars, based on their expertise and technical background, and non-partisan, which means they don't belong to political parties, meaning that they represent the voice of the silent majority.
This is the first Sudanese government to open nominations to the public, where candidates can submit their credentials via government electronic channels. The criteria for cabinet members include possessing Sudanese nationality regardless of race or religion, they must be non-partisan, and also have the highest levels of expertise required in relevant fields. Many have expressed hope that this could steer the country toward a new political phase.
It is essential to choose experienced ministers with a proven track record and integrity, which is the most important thing because we see that corruption has spread throughout all the government institutions. Irresponsibility is rampant, citizens are suffering, and services are generally poor.
I consider this the right decision at this right time, and I wish them success.
However, this move will directly challenge existing power-sharing deals with armed groups allied with the Sudanese army under the 2020 Juba Peace Agreement. Idris was appointed new prime minister last month by Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. He pledged at the time to review and dismantle what he called parallel governments of unnecessary councils and commissions that drain public funds.
That was Sophia Shimichero reporting. In Asia, floods, storms and rising sea levels have displaced about 9 million people in the Philippines this year, a number the UN warns will keep growing without long-term solutions and legal protections. Gretchen Malalat reports.
This used to be a village, now it's underwater. The floods came more than 10 years ago and never left. This is Sitio Nabong in Kalumpit, Bulacan. What was once a street full of children is now a waterway. Families battle through what remains of their homes. There are no roads here, no dry ground, just water. Sonny Mercado grew up in this community. His house, built by his parents, is now mostly submerged. He used to farm this land. Today, he works in construction and drives a tricycle to support his family. To stay in place, they have reinforced what is left of their home with wood, bamboo, and salvage roofing.
When the floodwaters rise higher than usual, we go into town, either to a relative's house or we rent a place temporarily. I have 3 daughters. They struggle just to get by, and they cannot go to school. We cannot stay here because when the water rises, there's no place to sleep.
Mercado wants to move his family to higher ground permanently. But without the money to buy land or build a home, he can't. He moves his family often, depending on the flood conditions. The United Nations Refugee Agency classifies him as an internally displaced person, or IDP, forced to move within its own country because of the worsening climate crisis. Climate displacement is now a reality for millions in the Philippines.
From 2023 to 2024, the number of IDP surged by 246% increase. That's 2.6 million in 2023, and it became 9 million in 2024.
The UN Refugee Agency and the Philippines Social Welfare Department are assisting displaced families, but support remains limited. There is still no national law that guarantees the rights of internally displaced persons. Proposed bill now pending in the Senate aims to change that by creating a legal framework for shelter, aid, and long-term protection.
Rising seas are swallowing coastlines, threatening to erase entire communities and with them their futures. The World Bank warns that without urgent action, climate change could displace over 200 million people by 2050. A wave of climate refugees already forming in places like here in the Philippines.
That was Gretchen Malalat reporting. Finally, in China, Singaporean Prime Minister Lawrence Wong is in Beijing for a 5-day official visit. His agenda includes meetings with Chinese President Xi Jinping, Premier Li Qiang, and top legislator Zhao Leji. Yu Yang sent this report.
Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong has arrived in Beijing at the invitation of Chinese Premier Li Qiang. Lawrence Wong is paying an official visit to China from Sunday to Thursday. This is actually Prime Minister Lawrence Wong's first visit to a non-ASEAN country since he took office in May. And this year actually marks the 35th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and Singapore. Actually, Singapore is China's 5th largest trading partner among Southeast Asian countries, and China has been Singapore's largest trading partner for 12 consecutive years. Well, last year, trade volume between the two sides hit over $111 billion, marking a year-on-year increase of 2.6%. Meanwhile, the two sides upgraded their bilateral free trade agreement protocol last December, as Singapore was actually the first Asian country to sign such an FTA with China. Experts say the implementation of such documents is actually expected to create more potential of cooperation in areas such as service trade and investment.
That was Yu Yang reporting. Now recapping the headlines, Israel and Iran have exchanged new rounds of attacks following US airstrikes against 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. Sudanese Prime Minister Kamil Idris has announced plans to set up a new non-partisan and technocratic government. And Singaporean Prime Minister Lawrence Wong is in Beijing for a 5-day official visit, with meetings with Chinese leaders on the agenda. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a 1-hour podcast news and magazine program. We would welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thank you for listening.